I collapsed in the second-floor hallway of Maple Grove Senior, living on an afternoon so quiet you could hear the clock ticking behind the nurse's station. There were no screams, no chaos. Just one moment I was walking, and the next the cold floor pressed against my back. Later, the doctor said my heart was tired from age. They said it gently, the kind of voice people use when they don't want to scare you. But lying there, staring up at the ceiling, stained with watermarks, I knew they were wrong. A heart doesn't get tired like that. A heart doesn't grow old that way. A heart breaks when it has carried too much, alone, for too long, without anyone asking if it can still bear the weight. 68 years. 68 years of being a mother. 68 years of giving without asking for anything back. As the world began to tilt, the voices around me sounded distant, as if heard through water. Someone grabbed my wrist. Someone called my name. "Ma'am, can you hear me? We're calling an ambulance. Who is your emergency contact?" I didn't have to think. The name drifted from my lips, weak but certain. "Daniel," I whispered. "My son, call him." They called, and Daniel did not come. No return call, no message. And somewhere in your mind, as you listen to this, a question begins to form, quiet but persistent. Why didn't my son show up? Before I go on, let me ask you something. Where are you hearing this story right now? In a quiet evening or during a rushed morning? If you stay with me, you'll understand why that fall made me reflect on my entire life. The ambulance siren faded, replaced by the cold white lights of the hospital. Everything happened quickly. The gurney. The IV lines, machines beeping steadily, as if counting time for me. The doctors and nurses worked with a reassuring professionalism. They asked for my name, age, and medical history. They spoke to one another in terms I recognized but didn't fully understand. A nurse adjusted my pillow and gave me a gentle smile. "Is your family on the way?" The question was so familiar that I almost answered reflexively. "Yes," I said, even though, inside, I wasn't sure. My phone lay on the small table beside the bed. The screen was dark. No vibration, no light. I stared at it longer than necessary, not because I was afraid, but because I still hoped. I hoped that at any second Daniel's name would appear. I hoped this silence was only temporary. But time inside a hospital doesn't move like time outside. It moves more slowly, heavier. And with every minute that passed without a sound from that phone, I felt myself shrink a little. No one said it out loud, but the silence was saying everything. The next morning, a nurse brought my personal belongings from the storage locker. The familiar small bag was placed on the table beside my bed. My phone was inside it, silent, just as it had been throughout the long night before. I didn't rush to open it. A part of me still hoped, even though that hope had grown very thin. When the screen lit up, I didn't see Daniel's name. No missed calls, no apologetic message, no explanation. Just a single notification at the top of the screen. "You've been tagged in a post." I should have put the phone down, I knew that. For a very brief moment, my instinct for self-protection spoke up, telling me I wasn't ready yet. But I tapped the screen anyway. The photo loaded slowly, piece by piece. First the blue sky, then the grass, and then my family came into clear view, whole, complete, as if there were no empty space that needed filling. Daniel stood beside Rachel, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. The two children sat in front, smiling brightly with melting ice cream cones. I recognized the park immediately. It was the same place I used to take Daniel when he was little, when life was simpler, and I was still someone he needed. I stared for a long time, not because the picture was beautiful, but because they looked comfortable, relaxed, as if their world was running smoothly, without any disruption at all. I scrolled down to read the caption, "A peaceful family day. No stress, no noise. Sometimes happiness comes from knowing who should be present." I read that sentence twice, then a third time, not because I didn't understand it, but because I couldn't believe it had been written so easily. My heart didn't start racing. It just grew heavier. A nurse walked into the room at that moment. She looked at me, then at the screen in my hand, and immediately stepped closer. "Are you okay, Mrs. Hale?" she asked, her voice softening. "I'm fine," I replied. I was already used to saying that. She didn't ask anything else. She quietly checked the machines, adjusted the IV line, and then left. I knew she didn't believe me, but I also knew she was kind enough not to force me to talk. When the room grew quiet again, I looked at the bottom corner of the photo. The timestamp was precise. Yesterday, 2:41 p.m. That was when the doctors were wheeling me from the emergency room to the cardiology ward. I remembered it clearly because I had asked them whether my heart could survive another episode. They were having a picnic, and I was lying on a gurney, wondering if I would wake up again. In that moment, I understood something straightforward. They hadn't forgotten me. If they had forgotten me, there would have been no need to write something like that. I hadn't been overlooked. I had been excluded. On purpose. I placed the phone face down on the table. But the image didn't disappear. It stayed there, clear and sharp, without needing to be seen again. My family didn't miss me. They simply chose a day without me and called it peaceful. Lying in that quiet hospital room, I began to think back to the early days after I moved into Maple Grove. Back then, Daniel still visited regularly. Not out of obligation, I believed. He usually came on Sunday afternoons, on time, rarely late. I still remember the feeling of hearing his familiar footsteps in the hallway. That alone was enough to make my entire week feel lighter. We sat by the window talking quietly. Daniel told me about work, about small everyday things. I didn't ask too many questions. I had grown used to not putting pressure on my son. Just hearing his voice and seeing him sitting across from me made me feel like I was still a part of his life. Things began to change when Rachel started coming along more often during those visits. She wasn't rude. She wasn't cold. On the contrary, Rachel was always polite, spoke gently, and smiled at the right moments. On the surface, no one could say she was unpleasant. But time told a different story. The visits slowly grew shorter, not suddenly, just little by little. From 2 hours to an hour and a half, then 1 hour, then 45 minutes. Rachel would often glance at her watch before speaking, her voice soft but firm. "We should head back a bit early. The kids still have homework." Daniel rarely objected. He would stand up almost immediately, gather their things, lean down, and place a light kiss on my forehead. "I'll come by again next week, Mom." Next week, and the week after that. Schedules began to appear more often in our conversations. A friend's birthday, the kids' extracurricular activities, a co-worker's party, a short weekend trip. No one ever said outright that I was an inconvenience. No one asked me to understand, but I did understand. I understood by sitting by the window every Sunday afternoon, watching other families at the senior living center welcome their visitors. I understood that by telling myself Daniel was busy, that all young families were like this, and that at my age, I shouldn't ask for too much. I didn't blame Rachel, at least not entirely. I knew life out there was expensive and demanding. I knew that raising children, keeping a job, and maintaining the image of a stable family wasn't easy. But I also knew something else. Daniel had never said, "Let me stay a little longer." He had never said, "Mom has waited all week just to see me." He didn't choose me, not because he hated me, but because, on the list of priorities, I slipped down slowly, quietly, so gently that no one noticed the moment I disappeared. There were no arguments, no harsh words. Just Sundays that passed without anyone knocking on my door, and by the time I realized there was no longer a place for me in my son's schedule, it seemed that this had already become normal for everyone else. The nurse on duty that morning was named Claire. I don't remember how many times I had seen her before, but this time felt different. Maybe because she wasn't in a hurry. Claire came into the room, checked the heart monitor, then stayed for a few extra seconds. Not the kind of pause meant for polite small talk, but the kind that comes from not needing to rush away. "How are you feeling now, Mrs. Hale?" she asked. "Better," I replied. It was the safest answer I had. Claire nodded and wrote a few lines on the chart. Then she pulled a chair over and sat down beside my bed. Not too close, not too far. Just close enough that I didn't feel like I was being examined. "Has your family gotten back in touch?" she asked, her tone gentle, not probing. I looked at the phone on the table. The screen was still dark. "No," I said. This time, I didn't add anything else. Claire didn't say, "I'm sorry," the way so many people do. She didn't offer the usual reassurance that everyone was busy. She just sat there in silence for a moment, as if weighing whether to say more. "I've worked here for almost 4 years," she said finally. "I've met a lot of people like you." I turned to look at her. "Not everyone is abandoned," Claire continued carefully, "but there are people who give for so long that they forget to look and see whether anyone is giving back." Her words didn't bring tears to my eyes. They didn't make me angry. But they stayed with me longer than I expected. I thought about all the times Daniel needed help, the times I transferred money without asking why, the times I told myself my son was just going through a temporary rough patch. I thought about how I was always the one who said yes because I didn't want to be a burden or seen as a troublesome old mother. Claire stood up and adjusted my blanket, a tiny familiar gesture, but not a careless one. "If you ever need to talk," she said, "you can call me. It doesn't have to be about your health." I nodded. I didn't promise, but I remembered. When Claire left the room, I realized something strange had just happened. A near stranger had stayed and listened to me, while the person I had given birth to and raised hadn't shown up. The thought didn't make me bitter right away. It simply placed a question in front of me, one I had always avoided. Had I grown used to being in last place for too long? I looked around the hospital room. No flowers, no cards. There was no sign that anyone was waiting for me to recover so I could go home. And yet, the panic I'd felt the day before was gone. Claire's words weren't advice. They were more like a mirror set in front of me, clear enough for me to see myself, but not forcing me to do anything right away. I wasn't ready to change, but for the first time I began to realize that the silence around me wasn't caused only by others, and sometimes realizing that is the first step towards something very different. I woke up in the early hours of my 3rd day in the hospital to the familiar vibration on the metal table beside my bed. Not once, not twice, but non-stop, rapid, as if someone were trying to wake the entire room. I reached for the phone, my eyes still blurry from sleep. 47 missed calls, all from the same name, Daniel. In the first instant, my heart tightened with the instinct of a mother. I thought of the children. I thought of accidents, illness, anything serious enough to make my son call that many times in one night. A message appeared beneath the call log. "Where are you? Call me right now, it's urgent." I looked at the clock. Nearly 6 in the morning. If something had truly happened to the kids, Daniel would have called the hospital. He knew exactly where I was. He'd had more than enough time to come. I set the phone down and took a deep breath. The initial panic settled, giving way to another thought, slower but more precise. I opened the local news site. The headline appeared almost immediately, as if it had been waiting for me. Hale & Comer Real Estate declares bankruptcy. After investors pull out. I read each line slowly. Stalled projects, overdue loans, lawsuits are being prepared. Dry, cold words. But the outcome was unmistakable. Daniel's company had collapsed. Suddenly, everything fell into place in a way that made it easier to breathe. 47 calls, a dawn message, the urgency, the panic I had never heard in my son's voice, not even when I was hospitalized. Daniel wasn't calling because of me. Daniel was calling because of money. I didn't feel angry right away. I didn't feel the pain I had imagined. There was only a cold sensation spreading through my chest, clear, steady, and frighteningly lucid. I thought back over the past few days. I had been lying on a gurney, unsure if I would wake up again. I had been lying in a hospital bed staring at a silent phone. Back then, none of the calls had been urgent. But when the source of money was about to disappear, I suddenly became someone worth finding. I picked up the phone, watching the screen light up and go dark again with each new vibration. Daniel was still calling, again and again. For the first time in many years, I didn't rush to answer. Not because I wanted to punish my son, but because I needed to be sure of one thing. If I called back now, would I be his mother? Or just his last solution? I placed the phone face down on the table. The vibration continued, but it no longer startled me. In the quiet that returned to the hospital room, a truth slowly emerged, without noise, but impossible to deny. This urgency had never been about me. I was only remembered when I became necessary. And for the first time, I allowed myself to sit with that feeling, without running from it, without justifying it, without comforting myself, just looking straight at it and listening to see whether I still wanted to keep living the same way. After finishing the article, I didn't reopen my phone right away. I knew Daniel was still calling. I also knew I needed a few more minutes before facing what I had deliberately avoided looking at for years. I opened my banking app. The screen loaded more slowly than usual, or maybe it just felt that way. When the number appeared, I had to look again to make sure I hadn't misread it. Balance, $914. That was all that remained after more than 40 years of working, saving, and living carefully. I didn't panic. I didn't feel dizzy. That number simply confirmed what I had already begun to understand since early morning. I tapped on the transaction history. The entries appeared steady, almost neatly aligned, month after month, year after year. Automatic transfer, Hale & Co. Automatic transfer, Hale & Co. I couldn't remember the last time Daniel had asked before taking money. Maybe it had been a very long time ago. Maybe it had never happened at all. I thought back to the first times. Daniel had called, his voice tense but trying to stay calm. Business was struggling, a short-term loan, just temporary. I had nodded yes before he even finished explaining. Then came the following time. Tuition for the kids, an unexpected expense, an investment opportunity that required a quick decision. Each time, I said yes before stopping to consider whether I could say no. I clearly remember the day I signed the papers to sell the old house. The house I had paid off where Daniel grew up, where there were once quiet evenings, I believed I would live out for the rest of my life. Daniel said Maple Grove would suit me better, safer, with people to look after me. "Good for you, Mom," he said. I believed him. Then came the other paperwork. Financial power of attorney. Joint accounts. Just in case of an emergency, Daniel explained, so I can help manage things for you. I didn't read carefully. I didn't ask many questions. I had never thought my own son would need to explain himself clearly to me. Upon reviewing the transaction history, I realized something I had never allowed myself to consider before. That money hadn't been taken all at once. It had been withdrawn gradually, little by little, very regularly, very reasonably. Nothing looked like fraud. Nothing triggered immediate resistance. Everything was wrapped in a familiar justification for family. I set the phone down and leaned my head back against the pillow. In the quiet hospital room, I let those thoughts pass without trying to push them away. I had convinced myself that this was what parents were supposed to do, that sacrifice was part of love. If I didn't help, who would help my child? But now, staring at a balance of less than $1,000, I no longer wondered how much I had given. I began asking a different question. Had anyone ever asked how much I had left? And when that question surfaced, clear, unavoidable, I knew I could no longer return to pretending everything was fine the way I used to. Not because I hated Daniel, but because I had grown far too accustomed to trading my own security to keep my son's life from being disrupted. For the first time, I looked straight at that truth, and I knew that from this moment on I would have to do something differently. I didn't call Daniel back that morning, not because I was avoiding him, but because there was something else I needed to do first. I borrowed a laptop from the hospital. The nurse brought it in, set it on the table, and asked if I needed any help. I shook my head. This was something I had to do myself. The bank's website appeared familiar. I had logged into it hundreds of times in my life, but never with this feeling. No trembling, no panic, just a slow clarity, as if everything had finally settled into its proper place. I navigated to the account management section. Daniel's name appeared immediately, attached to full access. I looked at the name for a moment, not angry, not sad, just tired. I clicked the request change button. The system asked for confirmation. I confirmed. A notification appeared, brief and straightforward. Access will be removed within 24 to 48 hours. That was all. There was no sound. Nothing dramatic happened. The world outside the hospital window continued on as usual. I went on. Savings accounts, authorization rights, everything I had signed under the belief that I was doing the right thing. I didn't erase the past. I simply stopped it. When I finished, I closed the laptop. My hands rested quietly on the blanket. I realized I wasn't crying. For many years, I had believed that protecting myself meant hurting my family. I was afraid of being called selfish. Afraid of being seen as someone who no longer cared about her children or grandchildren. But lying in that hospital room, I understood something straightforward. Respecting family does not mean letting them decide everything for you. And loving your children does not mean silently accepting having everything taken from you. My phone vibrated again, then again. Daniel's name lit up the screen. I didn't answer. Not because I wanted to punish my son, but because I wasn't ready to step back into the old role where I always had to explain, apologize, and justify the most basic limits of my own life. I placed the phone face down on the table. The room grew quiet again. For the first time in many years, that quiet didn't make me anxious. I thought of the other elderly residents at Maple Grove, people like me, who had spent their entire lives caring for their families, only to one day realize they needed to care for themselves, not because they had stopped loving, but because no one else was standing up to protect them. The decision I had just made didn't make me a bad mother. It simply made me a person with more precise boundaries. I didn't cut Daniel out of my life. I only cut off a role I could no longer carry. As I lay down to rest, the heart monitor beside me continued its steady rhythm. I breathed deeply, slowly. There was no applause, no recognition. But in that moment, I knew I had done something necessary, not for my son's future, but for the rest of my own life. It didn't take Daniel long to realize what had happened. That afternoon, my phone began vibrating nonstop. No longer silent, urgent calls, but messages appearing line by line, one after another, as if I were standing in the middle of a conversation where only one person was speaking. "What are you doing, Mom? The bank says the account was changed. Is there some kind of mistake?" I read them, but I didn't reply. A few minutes later, Rachel started calling. Then Daniel called again. Their names took turns lighting up the screen. I set the phone down and let it vibrate on the metal table. No turning it face down, no avoiding it. The following message came faster, longer. "You have to understand us. We're really in trouble right now. This directly affects the kids." The kids. I had heard those two words my entire life. Every time they were mentioned, I was the one who gave in first. I thought of my grandchildren, their future, and told myself I could endure just a little more. Daniel called again. This time, I answered, not because I had changed my mind, but because I wanted to hear what my son would say without the usual careful phrasing. "What are you doing?" Daniel's voice was rushed, tense. "Do you have any idea how serious this is?" "I know," I replied, calmer than I expected. "Go on." "The company is collapsing. The bank keeps calling. We have bills to pay, the kids' tuition. You can't do this right now." "Right now?" I repeated softly. "Yes," Daniel said, as if it were obvious. "You're destroying everything we've built." That sentence left me silent for a few seconds. Not because it hurt me, but because I recognized something painfully familiar. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "You're in the hospital." Not, "Do you need anything?" Just the consequences for their lives. Rachel cut in, her voice higher, sharper. "You can't be this selfish. The kids need stability. Do you want them to lose their home?" I took a deep breath. "I'm not taking anything away from you," I said. "I'm just keeping what's left of mine." "But you agreed to help," Daniel said. "You always say yes." "Yes," I replied. "And that's my fault." Both of them fell silent for a moment. Perhaps they weren't used to hearing me admit that without attaching an apology. Daniel spoke again, his voice softer now, but still carrying pressure. "You're hurting your family." I looked around the hospital room, at the bed I was lying in, at the machines monitoring my heartbeat minute by minute. "If a family only remembers me when it needs money," I said slowly, "then maybe that family forgot me a long time ago." I ended the call before Daniel could respond, not because I had won the argument, but because, for the first time, I didn't let guilt guide my decision. The phone vibrated again. I didn't pick it up. Those words didn't bring immediate relief, but they clarified something I needed to see. Love shouldn't be measured by how much one person sacrifices. And if a relationship survives only because I keep enduring, then perhaps it has been unbalanced for a very long time. 2 days after that call, after I had been transferred back to Maple Grove to continue my recovery, a white envelope lay outside my room. No stamp, no return address. Just my name, written in handwriting so familiar I recognized it instantly. Daniel. I picked up the envelope and stood still for a few seconds. There was no nervous anticipation as I had imagined, no fear of facing it, just a light weariness as if I already knew what was inside. I opened the letter, sat on the bed, and read slowly. Daniel wrote that he was sorry. No evasions, no lengthy justifications. He admitted he hadn't come to the hospital. He admitted he had thought about work, money, and pressure before thinking about me. He wrote that everything had slipped out of his control so quickly that he had grown used to me always being there, always ready, to the point of taking it for granted. He mentioned an old memory. When he was 8 years old, he fell at school and broke his arm. I had taken time off work and sat by his hospital bed all day and all night. He remembered how I held his hand for hours, no matter how tired my own hand became. "Back then," Daniel wrote, "I thought you would always be like that, always there. I never thought you had limits too." I stopped reading there, not because I was overwhelmed with emotion, but because of that familiar feeling of being seen. Too late. Daniel didn't blame Rachel. He didn't blame circumstances. He wrote that everything had been his own choice. He said he didn't expect me to forgive him right away. He only wanted me to know that now. He understood. The letter ended with a single, short sentence. "If you're willing to talk, I'll listen." I folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table. I wasn't angry, and I didn't feel the relief I had once imagined I would feel. Maybe because I had waited for these words for so many years. I had believed that if one day Daniel truly understood, everything would be healed. That once my son admitted his mistakes, the distance between us would disappear. But sitting in my familiar room at Maple Grove, I realized something else. Understanding doesn't mean returning to the way things were. An apology doesn't automatically erase what happened. It's a gesture of goodwill and a sign of understanding. Daniel wrote the letter when his life had already fallen apart, when there was no one left to carry the weight for him. I believe his apology was sincere, but I also know that if everything had been fine, if the company hadn't gone bankrupt, if the money were still there, I would probably still be just a name at the bottom of the list. I didn't tear up the letter, and I didn't reply. I placed it in the drawer, beneath medical papers and old bills. Not to forget it, but to keep it in its proper place. Daniel had apologized, and I had heard him. But for the first time in my life, I understood that whether to move forward or not no longer depended on my son's words. It depended on whether I wanted to return to a role that had drained me, and that answer, at least for now, was obvious. Once my health stabilized, I began returning to minimal, everyday routines. No big plans, no special goals, just things I used to do while waiting for something, now done simply for myself. One morning, I stopped by the small shop on the ground floor of Maple Grove. It sold little odds and ends, cards, candy, scarves, and a few potted plants near the window. I paused in front of a small rosemary plant. It wasn't wonderful, just a few slender green stems with a soft, familiar scent. I bought it, brought it back to my room, and placed it on the windowsill where the morning light came in. I watered it, not much, just enough. I didn't think it through deeply. I simply wanted something living, something that needed care but didn't demand too much. A few days later, the plant began to look healthier. The leaves grew darker. The scent became more noticeable whenever I opened the window. Around the same time, the front desk called me down to pick up a delivery. It was a carefully wrapped bouquet, still very fresh. Yellow flowers, full and bright, the kind Daniel used to send on special occasions. There was no card. I brought the bouquet back to my room, set it on the table, and looked at it for a while. The flowers were beautiful. There was no denying that. But the feeling inside me was very different from before. I didn't rush to find a vase. I didn't trim the stems or change the water. I simply left it there, as it was. In the days that followed, I continued watering the rosemary every morning. I opened the curtains, checked the soil, and turned the pot so it could catch the sunlight. It became an ordinary habit, but one that made me feel fully present in my day. The bouquet was different. With each passing day, the petals began to droop. The yellow faded. I noticed it, but I didn't intervene. Not because I was angry, but because I no longer felt the need to keep something alive on someone else's behalf. One afternoon, when I returned to my room after a group activity, I saw that the flowers had wilted entirely. Petals had fallen across the table. I gathered them up, wrapped them in paper, and carried them to the trash bin at the end of the hallway. There was no ceremony, no hesitation. When I returned to my room, the rosemary plant was still standing quietly on the windowsill, green and healthy. I brushed my fingers lightly over the leaves, breathed in the familiar scent, and sat down beside it. I wasn't thinking about Daniel at the time, and I wasn't trying to send any kind of message. I simply realized something very clearly. Some things grow when given time and steady care. And some things, no matter how beautiful, cannot survive if they only appear when someone feels the need to make amends. I stopped trying to hold everything together with my own effort. I cared for what responded, and I let be what no longer belonged to the rhythm of my life. That evening, I opened the window and let the rosemary scent drift gently through the room. The night was calm. There was no phone vibrating, nothing needed an immediate reaction, just a very new feeling. That my life, small, quiet as it was finally moving at its own pace. Life at Maple Grove gradually returned to its familiar rhythm. In the mornings, there was the sound of meal carts rolling down the hallway. In the afternoons, sunlight slanted through the trees in the courtyard. I began joining small activities again, not to fill time, but because I wanted to. I played cards with Mrs. Baker every Thursday afternoon. We didn't talk much about our children. We talked about the weather, about the best meals we had ever cooked, about small things that didn't require anyone to explain or justify themselves. Some people asked about Daniel. They asked naturally, without too much curiosity. "Does your son visit often?" I smiled. No longer the strained smile I used to wear. "He's busy," I said, and that was enough. I no longer felt the need to protect my son's image in front of others. Nor did I need to soften his absence. Some things, once you accept them exactly as they are, stop hurting. I came to understand that family isn't made up of people who show up only when they need something from you. Family is made up of those who are present, even when there's nothing to gain, even when all you need is a hand to hold or simply someone's presence. Older people don't need much. We don't ask for grand gestures. We just need to be remembered, to be asked how we are, to be seen as living people, not as resources that have already served their purpose. If you still have parents or grandparents, call them, not to ask what they need, but to ask how they are. That difference matters more than you think. I don't hate Daniel, and I no longer wait for him to change for my sake. If one day he truly learns how to be present for others, I hope it begins with his own children. That would be the greatest gift he could give. As for me, I choose to live the rest of my life more quietly. I care for my rosemary plant every morning. I open the window to let in the sunlight. I talk with people who truly sit down and listen. I no longer wait for late phone calls, and I no longer measure my worth by how much I sacrifice. I've learned that love shouldn't drain you dry, and choosing peace for yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. If this story made you think of someone, perhaps a person you haven't called in a long time, or even yourself during a time when you felt forgotten, you are not alone. Many people are learning, little by little, to choose themselves, just as I am. If you'd like to share your story, leave a few lines. There are always people here who are willing to lend a listening ear, and if stories like this matter to you, stay with us. Sometimes, simply knowing that someone understands is enough to keep going. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my story. At an age when people often believe everything is already over, I've come to understand something straightforward: keeping peace in your heart. It is the most beautiful way to continue living.